you're going to Rhode Island in a few months, you said.
Yes, yes, at the beginning of March, that's right.
That's exciting. Is there like a pilgrimage to visit Lovecraftian stuff in Rhode Island, or are you going for other reasons?
No, I'm a guest of honor at the Horror Writers of America, Horror Writers Association, rather. It's the Stoker Con.
Oh, wow, that's cool.
Um,
That's a pretty exciting thing to be a part of. Are you do you regularly take part of American conventions and horror writing?
well, when I can, yes. I mean, or to be honest, when they invite me, because we tend to be stuck over this side of the Atlantic. But I've been to a few. Yeah, yeah.
SturgerCon. You know what I'm curious about? What do you think of the current state of horror fiction as it's being written today compared to when you started, 43 years ago?
Oh, more than 43 years ago, more than half a century ago. I mean, my first story was published in 1962, and the first book in 1964.
Yeah, you're prolific. Your bibliography is amazing. I mean, what do you have, 50 novels published at this point?
I'm not sure it's that many. I've lost count. I don't really count, but no. As far as the state of the field is concerned, no, I think it's pretty vital. There are a lot of good writers, a whole new generation, basically. I mean, some of which is being published, sort of in the mainstream, and some not. But no, I think quite honestly, it's as vigorous as it ever was. So no, I'm very heartened by the current state.
As somebody who loves Lovecraft, you've got to be excited about the resurgence. I mean, I don't know whether or not he ever disappeared from the zeitgeist, but recently in the last 10 years or so, it's definitely been kind of back in terms of popularity.
Yes, and I mean, not simply that, but I think it's fair to say that he has been accepted to some extent into the mainstream. So you do have your Penguin Modern Classics edition and Library of America and things of that nature. So I think his position is now secure.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating to think that he at one time was eating cans of beans,
well,
in poverty, poor, and now he'd be a millionaire, right?
Well, Van Gogh never sold a painting in his life.
Cut off his ear too. Stroker's the same way. I mean, when he wrote Dracula, it was one seminal work, and he basically struggled, didn't he?
Yeah. Yes.
I guess, and the horror as a medium, I guess, is one of those genres where you don't. Do you think you find as much success while you're alive as you do when you're dead? I mean, Mary Shelley's another one that kind of lingered a little bit during her life and then blew up in the 20th century. I mean, Frankenstein's all over the place.
Oh gosh, yes. I mean, I suppose to some extent that has to do with the cinema, but equally the staying power of a considerable work of literature. I mean, some folk obviously. I think there are those who were successful and will remain successful, and there were those who were successful in their day. And well, I mean, Dennis Wheatley is hardly remembered now, I don't think.
Yeah, and do you think there'll be a resurgence of them in terms of their popularity later on? I mean, how did Lovecraft manage to stay afloat like he did?
Well, he did so by starving himself and basically spending what little money he had on traveling around. He survived on the absolute edge, I think it's fair to say, particularly over his last few years and particularly the last days of his life. But there was still that drive to create, and even when he wasn't writing fiction, there were still these immense creative acts that were his letters to his correspondents.
That's true. He was a prolific letter writer, wasn't he? Constantly engaging with conversation over the mail.
Absolutely.
And so many people he engaged with. Are you similar in that regard, or do you take his? I mean, you consider yourself a Lovecraftian style writer, strange fiction, stuff like that, right?
Well, I mean, I regard myself as very much in the tradition of horror fiction, which extends from Poe on the one hand and Le Fanu on the other, through Arthur Machen, Algernon Blackwood, M.R. James, certainly Lovecraft and Bierce, and then into the modern era through, well, Lovecraft brought us into the modern era obviously in many ways, but through Fritz Leiber in particular in my case, and then onward through onward through Steve King and Ted
Yeah.
Klein and those who are writing today. I mean, I think there is a genuine tradition, and there's a genuine continuity. I certainly regard myself as being part of that.
I definitely agree with the
early...
continuity. In terms of Stephen King himself, he agrees that Lovecraft is part of his inspiration growing up.
Yes, very much so. Yes, yeah, and of course, I mean, Revival is a Lovecraftian novel.
Oh, is it? I did not even realize that. I only know of his connection to Lovecraft through a literature of the occult class I took in college. He was included in the anthology.
Yes. No, I mean, Steve has written several Lovecraftian stories, but most recently, certainly Revival is explicitly Lovecraftian. It refers to the Book of the Worm, which is actually Robert Bloch's invention, but very much in the Lovecraftian area, and the apocalyptic finale of Revival is purely Lovecraftian, yeah.
And you can get away with that nowadays, can't you? I mean, in the scope of your career and all that you have written, what do you enjoy writing the most? The monster tales, the ghost stories? What elements of your career have you just gobble up?
I mean, in a way, you hope it's whatever you're writing at the moment is what gives you pleasure, and so it has to be something that engages your imagination. But fair enough. I mean, your question, really, I suppose the uncanny is what I like doing most. So, and perhaps the stranger the better, So, I mean,
it's that term strange, though, isn't it? It's lovely in terms of horror fiction, because I keep going back to Lovecraft because I'm a fan of the idea of the strange fiction and the strange works and all that stuff. I mean, what's your definition of strange in this context?
Well, I mean, I suppose when I say strange, probably a better word is the one that Lovecraft used to employ anyway, which is weird.
Weird,
and,
okay.
There's that great Vandermeer anthology, Jeff and Anne Vandermeer's The Weird, a huge doorstop of a book, which ranges all over the world for its contents, including, very kindly of them, A Story of Mine. And I suppose it is something that that's beyond everyday experience in some way. It's either the familiar that's turned around to expose the uncanny underside, or it's something stranger still, the sense of the alien, whether it be from way across the universe, or even in some hidden place of the world, or not even hidden necessarily. I mean, you can find it in the depths of the forest. You can find it, out on the sea. You find it at the top of the mountain. But basically, I think the only answer I can really give your question is, you know it when you encounter it.
Get weird fiction, and it's not necessarily horror. It's just the stuff that you wouldn't necessarily have a definition for in scientific terms. It's the stuff that you dig up and go, oh no, it's what?
Sure. I mean, in terms of Lovecraft, I think that the perfect example of that, my favorite actually, of his stories, if I had to choose just one, would be The Color Out of Space, where again, it is nothing more than, in a sense, a color out of space. It's something totally indescribable because there's no words for it in the spectrum that we perceive. But at the same time, it's, as one of the characters says, it's from someplace where things aren't as they are here, and the sense that it gives of that, I think, it conveyed in that story is tremendous. It's kind of universe shaking, if you like. But equally, you can find that in, say, a story by Algernon Blackwood like The Willows, or Arthur Machen, a great story, The White People. Again, it's this sense. I think to some extent it might be the sense of something that is beyond description in a way that you can only hint at, or that it's larger than the story. The words do their best to encompass it, but they can't quite. The best they can do is convey a sort of impression of the experience, and they're reaching for something beyond and larger than we can ever quite grasp.
Or wanting to be larger than we can grasp. You know, that thing that you just catch out of the peripheral of your vision that you don't know
Yes,
exactly what it is. When you turn around, it's gone. You're like, oh my, what was that? And you try to put it down in 5,000 words or something along those lines.
yes, yes. Oh, yes, that's what you try and do.
Right? I
I've been
mean,
trying
go ahead.
most of my life. Maybe one time I'll succeed.
I mean, how close do you think you've come to getting Weird Tales written in a proper format that you're proud of? I mean, have you gotten a sense of that thing yet? That peripheral vision? Have you gotten it down on paper in a way that
Well,
you're
yeah, I mean,
proud of in terms of your career?
every so often, you know, there will be maybe a passage in a story, you know, the darkest part of the woods, for instance, a novel from, well, from the turn of the century now, actually, a novel of mine. You know, there are moments in that, even scenes where I think maybe, you know, I've managed to encompass it a little bit. But I mean, something like The Grin of the Dark, for instance, which is much more comedy of paranoia, if you like, but it's still, I think it has a fair old sense of the thoroughly strange. That this trilogy that I'm presently writing, which again does have its roots in my old Lovecraftian work. Certainly there are scenes that I'm kind of happy with at the moment, but of course, who knows? In a couple of years, I'll be seeing how far short I fell, and it's always, in a sense, you know, it's because you fell short, you go and do the next one, in the hope that will get that little bit closer.
As a writer, man, every piece that you're currently writing is your best, right? And the ones that you've just finished need work, or they're not exactly the way that you wanted them to be, or not polished enough. That's the cruel fate of being an artist, isn't it? It's never what you did, it's what you're doing.
Exactly. Sometimes you kind of lose sight of the fact that, you know, even though it's not what you were aiming for, it may be something else to the reader, you know. And it's kind of encouraging when people say, well, you know, they liked it, and maybe say why they liked it. That I can see, well, you know, maybe I achieved something inadvertently as well as failing to achieve what I was aiming for.
It's very interesting. You brought up Van Gogh earlier, and I love his art. Obviously, he's one of my favorites. Starry, Starry Night, and all that. I just really love his art a lot. I wonder. I don't think when he was painting, he enjoyed his art. I don't think that he was saying, "I'm creating masterpieces that are going to be appreciated throughout all ages."
No, I think he was just driven, you know, as one is, driven to, you know, to try and convey his vision, get it down in front of him where he could, you know, look at it, if you like, objectively, or put it out that way. And I suppose, you know, poor guy, he was hoping somebody would come along and buy some of the canvases, which didn't happen. But all the same, you know, the thing is, he was always true to his vision. I think that's the crucial thing. And even, you know, so he wasn't around to appreciate that his vision was eventually appreciated. Still, you know, it's the authenticity that has made it last.
That's the maddening part about it, though, isn't it? In terms of history, we can look back and say he had a consistency to his art. But I don't know if he felt it, though. I mean, his brother basically took care of him throughout his entire career. And didn't he flitter in and out of relationships with prostitutes? And I mean, what a devastating life that guy had. And to end up on my wall. It's very interesting to me also that obviously Lovecraft could have done anything, right? I mean, he could have done teaching, he could have done something else, but instead he ate beans and wrote weird fiction. It's the choice, isn't it? It's not, you hunger for it. That's the sad thing, though, isn't it? In terms of what we were just talking about, it's what you're doing now that you think is the best, not what you've already done. So even you as the artist, you question whether or not you're producing the best work you possibly can do, or whether you should be doing something else.
Yes. I think by now I've decided that I can't be doing anything else. It's too late.
Yeah, it's too late to decide that you want to be I don't know, Marvel shaper or something along those lines.
Yeah, that's right.
I would say that you've actually reached some kind of pinnacle of success. I mean, you are considered one of the masters of horror at this point in time, aren't you? Or, I mean, if I look your name up on the internet, that's what pops up, that people look to you for guidance in terms of what's already been done so they can base their work on making another generation feel small and insignificant.
No, what I hope is that, you know, it makes them, you know, want to do their own thing. And I think it has, actually. I think, you know, a fair bunch of writers. Well, I was very touched recently because I don't know if you know this, Joe Pulver and Scott Anialowski, they edited an anthology called Darker Companions, which is basically a bunch of writers, very distinguished writers, and too, who have written stories as a kind of showing how they're influenced by my stuff, as apparently they felt they were. And I found that very humbling and touching, but also very exciting, and amazed that I could have done all the stuff that they seem to think I did. So that itself, makes it all worthwhile.
Yeah, I mean, looking at what you have accomplished, I mean, what was it? I think I read on your Wikipedia page that you wrote your first novel at 10 years old, or something along those lines.
Well, it wasn't a novel, actually. It was a collection of short stories, but 11 years old. Believe me, it was a terrible book. I mean, it's, it was kind of hung together out of all the bits of stories that I'd liked, and but I mean, it was coherent. The short stories, I mean, they were very, very short, like most of them under 2,000 words. I mean, the hugely ambitious one, I remember thinking at the time, this was my magnum opus, is all of 4,000 words long,
Yeah.
and was fundamentally, believe it or not, a kind of almost a digest of Dennis Wheatley's The Devil Rides Out, with some new stuff put in, but you can recognize where it's coming from. So that was my first real influence. The first writer I sort of concentrated on imitating. I got away from that pretty quickly, but even there I was beginning to learn some of the stuff that I had to do. And although it certainly didn't see publication, well, apart from Bob Price, Robert Price published it as an issue of Crypt of Cthulhu for the amusement of all concerned. It's now a rarity, and well, the world is better off without it.
That's interesting. So you don't even have a physical copy of it that you could publish at one point or another?
I've got one, and I've actually got the actual real thing. The handwritten, crayon illustrated copy.
Oh my. That's so cool. I don't have anything from when I was a kid. I mean, I kind of practiced the whole Buddhist thing of not getting rid of your possessions and not holding on to things. All those marbled covered notebooks just gone completely.
Yes.
That's so cool that you still have the crayon.
Well, I mean, Poppy Z. Bright has got one from when she was 3. I mean, now, of course, Poppy is Billy Martin, but that 3-year-old work is still extant, I believe.
Do you find yourself going through your old work from your childhood and on, just kind of marveling or getting inspired by it?
Well, not so much inspired, amused. I think amused is the word. But I kind of look at it and think, well, by God, I was already doing something then. There was already,
Right.
It must have been the seed of stuff in that. And I mean, the weirdest thing of all, I mean, even there's sort of at one remove a Lovecraftian influence, because there's a story with a Shoggoth in it. And the reason for that was that when I was, I think, 10 or 11, a magazine, a one-shot magazine came out in Britain called Screen Chills and Macabre Stories. And this included Bob Bloch's story, Notebook Found in a Deserted House, which Bob didn't know. I spoke to him later on. He didn't know that it had never been reprinted there. So they'd obviously just ripped it off from an issue of Weird Tales, and they obviously went out of print before they could be sued. So, but the thing was, at that age, I read this tremendous, I mean, I still think it's one of the great mythos stories, actually, and probably Bob's best work in that particular area. And I still found it genuinely frightening, so, and very much a classic instance of how Bob would take the Lovecraft and do it in a colloquial voice of the kind that Lovecraft wouldn't have been able to achieve. And that's about, basically I drew on that when I was 11. And so if you like, I was a Lovecraftian even way back then.
Yeah, that's I mean, how could you not be, in terms of being a fan of the weird tale?
Oh, well, the
And
problem with that, though, you see, was that in those days you couldn't get Lovecraft in Britain. It wasn't until I was 14, which was 1960, that the very first British paperback collection of Lovecraft ever came out. Previous to that, you could only find him in the odd anthology, and I'd certainly, read enough to know that I wanted more. And when I found this copy, it was a book called Cry Horror, actually. I saw it in a shop window. It was an absolute kind of epiphany for me. I was actually afraid, I didn't have the money on me to buy it. When I came back, it would be gone. But luckily, I found I just had the 2 and 6pence necessary to buy it. And so I grabbed it, took it home, and spent the next day reading it from cover to cover. And that was my immersion in Lovecraft, and that's why I started imitating him.
Isn't it fascinating that Lovecraft almost disappeared? That we wouldn't have him in our culture today, but for something. And I mean, what is that something? What happened?
Well, I mean, something that to a certain extent, I think we'd have to argue it was Arkham House, and August Derleth, who was keeping the Lovecraft alive and promoting his work and bringing out new volumes, some of them with very minor Lovecraftian stuff that it was being reprinted in hardcover for the first time. But still, certainly I remember when I was, again in my early to mid-teens and discovered that Arkham House was still operating and you could buy their books through a British agent. I mean, I was hugely excited by buying a book like The Shuttered Room, even though it contained almost no actual Lovecraft. Well, it contained a couple of short stories reprinted, but in the main it was stuff about Lovecraft and so forth. But even that was sufficient to keep my imagination still ablaze with the Lovecraftian flame.
Excuse me, sorry about that. My phone
then
just
I
went
suppose
off.
Okay, and then gradually, I suppose, it began to percolate out of the mainstream. To some extent, I suppose, there was the Tolkien explosion on the American campus of The Lord of the Rings, and then a little bit later, I think there was a certain amount of Lovecraft beginning to his work being read by students, and gradually things branched out, more anthologies, and then eventually, of course, movies. Well, even those started in a slow way. And I mean, the very first one, of course, was disguised as an Edgar Allan Poe film, The Haunted Palace. But it's still not a bad Lovecraftian film, that I think. And when you actually went to see a film in which the Necronomicon was mentioned on the screen, there was a certain frisson in that. I mean, these days we're used to it, but back then, it really was an event for those of us who were in the know.
In the know in terms of, I mean, God, just that one little bit of comment that you just made, it never disappeared. I mean, it was always there. Thinking about all those movies too that came out in the 50s and the 60s, well, definitely the 60s, right? I mean, he's been around since all that time. And going through what these weird tales are, it's really not about the macabre, is it? It's not about blood and guts and freaking you out. It's about what? It's about theme and language.
Yeah, theme. It's about the sense of the cosmic. It's about the sense of the alien in whatever form you care to present it. Although, of course, it's interesting that there's a whole kind of gradual developing theme in Lovecraft of the narrator who discovers that he is the alien. So, beginning with Arthur German, who sets himself on fire, and then the outsider who basically retreats into madness and forgetfulness, up to the narrator of the Shadow over Innsmouth, who you might think is possibly going to have a sort of positive experience when he swims off and joins the deep ones. I think that ending is at the very least highly ambiguous and kind of in a way shows how Lovecraft was developing.
Or it shows his insanity, right? I mean, he's swimming off someplace where he doesn't belong. I mean, ultimately, probably death is probably going to be as a resulting, is going to result from that activity, right? I mean,
we'll see. We never quite know, yeah.
What's that? I'm sorry,
So I suppose we never quite know, but again, that it's part. It seems to be part of a movement in Lovecraft where the creatures in at the mountains of madness, the alien creatures, are actually described as being, they're described as men. That they were, in a sense, they were men. They're certainly seen as being more human than many of Lovecraft's previous alien creatures. And there's this increasing, if you like, the sort of partial embracing of the alien in Lovecraft toward his end. It's not a simple development by any means, but it seems to me to be there.
Yeah, I mean, it's all psychological, isn't it? It's all perceptive or perspective. It's very interesting, and it works.
I was going to say, I think one of the other things that makes that makes Lovecraft last, and will always make him last, is the sense of language. Now, there's this ridiculous
Yeah.
idea that's often pervaded that Lovecraft only had one style, and that style was overwritten and purple, which of course is utterly not the case. I mean, in fact, in his best work, okay, there are a few stories like, let's say, The Lurking Fear or The Hound, which are pretty florid in their prose, no doubt about that. But something like The Rats in the Walls is hugely controlled, very, very gradual, modulation of language, build up of the tension of prose and so forth. And he varies the style enormously toward the effect that he wants to achieve. I mean, I actually think The Rats in the Walls is in many ways a story about language. And ultimately, at the end, it's very, 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 very vividly about the breakdown of language, as the narrator retreats into almost a pre-human lingo, and finally into madness. I mean, I think the best of Lovecraft is repays any amount of rereading and analysis.
Well, I want to read The Rats in the Wall now. I'm gonna have to take a look at it after we get off this hangout. It's fascinating to think that. I mean, what do you think of the current spectrum of weird tales, horror fiction, macabre that's being written?
We're seeing it, we're all ranging all the way it can, from the psychological through the uncanny and the spectral, the ghostly, and all the way toward the sort of Lovecraftian and Blackwoodian sense of cosmic awe. There's a very impressive range to it, I think, and but you're seeing contemporary developments and contemporary spins on these themes, which again means that it's not become stale. On the contrary, it's being reimagined by a whole different generation.
That's fascinating, because when Lovecraft was writing, not many people were actually writing, correct? I mean, you have this mechanical thing that you had to wrestle with and buy ribbon for and buy paper for, and you had to make sure it was perfectly typed, and that was arduous to send to a publisher. And if it wasn't perfect, you wouldn't get published or something along those lines. But nowadays, everybody's got a computer. Everybody can sit there. We've got access to all this great literature, and people like yourself who've come, and written these great lists of work, and I guess there's no excuse but to reach beyond at this point in time.
Well, no, that's absolutely right, and I mean, more power to the new writers. They're keeping the whole thing alive.
The only harsh thing is the spigot is so small.
Yes.
I mean, would you agree that back when you were first emerging into your career, you could have a font of writers?
Yes.
And nowadays, it seems like money struggles, aren't many publishers, aren't many magazines anymore. There aren't any pulp publishers. I mean, it's really difficult to get your voice out into the world.
Well, I suppose, yeah. I mean, technically speaking, you could publish your own work, but yes, I mean, I think
that's the unfortunate thing, though, too. That slush pile of self-published authors is so gigantic. Forget about it. You just disappear, don't you?
There's far too much of that, and obviously, far too much of it is not very good, and in dire need of an editor. But I suppose people learn that, and at the very least, I suppose if it's online, you can sample it and decide whether you can tell pretty early on if it's going to be worth your attention, or you're actually shelling out some money to buy it. I think the small press, though, is pretty vital these days. There are a fair old bunch of them out there. I mean, PS in Britain, Dark Regions in America, Subterranean, Fedogan and Bremer, all sorts of. I mean, I could list them at some length. But equally, I do think that that there are a fair number of mainstream publishers who are gradually, a bit tentatively, but I think they're doing it. They're taking on horror again. Maybe to some extent they're not calling it horror. I mean, actually, this rather has started to happen to me over the last, just publishing my stuff, but not necessarily calling it horror. But presumably people know what it is anyway, because I've written it. But with new writers, a fair number of things are coming out, not necessarily labelled as horror, but that's what they are. And in a way, I think we're returning to the situation we had before the major boom of the 70s, where it became a category in the bookshops, and you would actually have the the horror section. I mean, in some ways, that was a good thing, because you could go, if that's what you love, there you could go and find it all there in one place in the shop. On the other hand, there was this sort of hiving it off from the mainstream and ghettoizing it to some extent, and it was probably losing some readers, some of it, that it would otherwise have held. Because when I started reading in the field, there certainly wasn't the horror section in the bookshop or the library, and you just had to go around looking for likely titles and likely packaging and so forth. And
libraries do that, don't they? That's how I grew up. My mom's a librarian, so it was like I'd go into a library and just scan the the spines of books, what looked good, who have I read before.
And exactly, by that method, you probably found stuff you would never otherwise have found. And
definitely read outside of my genre, that's for sure.
Yeah, me too. And that seems to me to be a very good thing, but equally, we find the stuff we really want because we've got sort of an instinct for it. And maybe this is now, where things are moving back to, and I think that's not altogether a bad thing.
No, it's not. And I was watching one of your videos. I can't remember which one it was, but you were talking about Reddit, which really surprised me. And I'm a big fan of Reddit. I'm a big fan of the writing community, the writing community on Reddit. I believe that it's really a fantastic tool to use. And how are you using it? Are you on there?
Oh, I mean, to be honest, I mainly just go on there to talk to folk and, see what's interesting, and maybe, that people want, sometimes I can actually answer a question. People are searching for some sort of obscure thing, and I can tell them what it is. That's kind of gratifying, And
that's why Reddit's famous, isn't it? In terms of the being able to connect and to provide your information and to glean other people's information too. I mean, it's just a really great database of interaction.
And also, sharing your enthusiasm, that could be also a pretty good thing, because it seems like, there are always people on Reddit say, wanting to know what they should read, in some particular area, and maybe you can point them in a good direction too.
That's exactly where I was going to, in terms of the word of mouth, which I think nowadays, what was it, in Freakonomics or something like that a little while ago, maybe a decade or more, they were talking about the different types of people, and mavens are just so important nowadays. They recommend what you should read, and if it doesn't come from their mouth or like spread verbally, you're not just going to be oblivious to it, right? There's no way you can sell any more to people.
Well, no, I mean, there's so much, as you were saying before, there's so much. It's a question of, you hope your star will shine that little bit brighter than others.
I mean, how do you clear the slush pile? I mean, somebody like yourself, you have to constantly looking to see what is in the zeitgeist, right? What's being written about. I mean, how do you clear the slush pile if you're not hearing about it?
No, to be honest, I don't do that. No, I mean, I'm too busy writing my own stuff. And if somebody else has done the theme, well, fine, we'll do it differently. I don't care. I mean, there was a time when I many writers have this where you'd panic because you think, oh, somebody's already done this, or I mean, I'll give you a particular example. I was writing a book called Incarnate, and this was back in the early 1980s, which is effectively about dreams and reality becoming inextricable, or an illusory world invading this one. And I went to see Videodrome, the Cronenberg movie, which I like very much. But at the same time, I was sitting there thinking, well, there's no point. He's done it. All the stuff I was going to do, he's done. So why would I bother? Well, I think the reason I did bother because I was already about 100 pages into writing the book, and I wasn't going to abandon it. And anyway, eventually I thought, well, no, actually, I am doing something different. We're in the same basic area, but it's not the same. There's an anthology from the 1930s called the Fothergill Omnibus, in which you have a whole bunch of distinguished writers. And the thing was, they were all given a plot to write, beginning, middle, and end by the editor. It's the same plot in every one, and it's a sort of a salutary experience to read a few of those stories and see how differently different writers take exactly the same theme. So
yeah, it's like a fingerprint, isn't it? In terms of our creativity, it's never going to be the same as the guy next to you unless you're copying word for word.
Exactly.
There was a science fiction author, and his name is gone, but he wrote Neuromancer, I think back in the 90s.
Oh, well, William Gibson.
There you go, Gibson. And
Yeah.
he was so discouraged because he'd seen a movie, I think maybe The Matrix or something along those lines. It's like, oh man, this is my exact plot of the novel that I'm really striving hard to finish.
Yes.
I might as well just toss the thing in the trash and give up. But he didn't, and now he's one of the big names of
Oh,
speculative fiction.
absolutely. So yes, no, I think you've got to you've got to proceed and you know and believe in the way you yourself do it, because you know if you've got any kind of a personality, you know, a creative personality, a writer's or a vision of sorts, you know, it'll be yours. It won't be the same thing.
Do you think it helps to have a vision and like an
Yeah.
overarching idea of what you want to do with your career, or are you constantly defining that?
Oh no, I'm just constantly trying not to repeat myself, basically. But of course, you do. You think you're not repeating yourself, but in a sense, you do have themes that keep coming back, or you know, on which you write variations, and sometimes you're not even aware of it until you've done it.
Yeah.
But you know, you do your best to not to be too predictable, and well, you know, I've kind of, I think by now built a readership who don't expect me to do the same as I did last time. I mean, I appreciate, you know, it's fun to be able to go to a writer and know that you're going to get something like the same as last time. And in in a way, my career, particularly in terms of the novel, it's so kind of haphazard in a way, you know, following a psychological suspense novel with a kind of cosmic horror novel, followed by a ghost story, followed by a black comedy. That I think people have got used to this by now, and with what's predictable is the unpredictability.
Do you deliberately try to shift things up, or is it just whatever comes to you in the moment?
Well, I think it's mostly that I don't want to do the same thing as I did last time in a literal sense. You know, I don't want to write what I was to write this year, what I was writing last year. I mean, maybe I might write what I wrote 10 years ago, but in a different way with a different emphasis. But I really would prefer, to move on in some way every time. And well, I think I'm pretty well doing that. I mean, mind you, I should say, of course, that over the last 3 years, the novels have been 3 novels in a trilogy, and that, of course, does mean, in a sense, you're not repeating what you did last year, but you're certainly developing, and still, your foundation is what you did last year. I must confess, I actually did like doing this. I can't imagine ever doing another one, but because basically, I believe the only reason to write a trilogy, is if there is a reason to write 3 books rather than just one big book split in 3 bits. And I did find a reason for this, and therefore, I mean, we basically follow the central characters over, well, nearly 70 years, in fact, and each 2 books are several decades apart. We see the characters change, but equally there's the supernatural element that is constantly underlying this that they're trying to deal with.
When is the trilogy being published, or is it already out?
The first 2 novels are out. I'm rewriting the 3rd one, so that will be out, I would suspect, next autumn.
Oh wow, okay. How long does it take you to work on one of these things? A
Well,
novel from start to finish?
each novel, well, most of a year. I mean, the first draft is going to be 5 or 6 months maybe, and then I'll tend to leave that, well, let it sit for a while and write a couple of short stories at least, so that I can come back to it with a kind of objective or relatively objective eye. So then I reread the thing, and then I get to rewrite it, which is onto the computer. I mean, the first draft is always written ink,
Yeah.
rewrites onto the computer, and then I kind of go for it with all the savagery I can muster, and improve everything inside if I possibly can. And that's going to be a couple of months' work, and then print that out, reread that. I've still got to do more work, and eventually it goes to my agents, and well, off we one hopes, off we go.
Do you get a lot of pushback on your work when you submit it to agents or publishers? I mean, do you enjoy that at this stage of the game, or is it one of those where you've basically pretty much established yourself as a name, and they say, okay, thank you so much, and the book gets published?
Well, I mean, I can always use an editor's eye. You can always use, somebody else's, skilled eye on the work. There'll always be little things that they can point out. But I mean, you never stop learning, and therefore you can never stop being taught either. It's always useful that if an editor gives you that impetus, then often enough, I mean, having said that, I mean, probably like most writers, my immediate reaction to an editorial letter is, "You've got to be kidding,"
Right? I
And then
mean, not anywhere
half an
near.
hour, yeah, half an hour later, you think, well, hang on,
Yeah,
maybe they
yeah.
do have a point after all.
It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, in terms of you're willing to accept criticism because you want it. You want to grow as an artist, but once you get that criticism, it's like, okay, why don't we go outside and
Yes,
talk about this for a second, buddy? And
yeah,
then you
that's
calm down,
right.
and you're like, okay, you're right. I need to look at this in a little more.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I write a lot
Yeah.
on a monthly basis. I work on my novel, and then I have like 3 or 4 short fiction pieces going at the same time. And that
Ah,
Bradbury poisoned my mind a long time ago, because he, obviously is a prolific novelist, and his idea was you should always every month finish 3 or 4 short fiction pieces. But it sounds like you're of a singular mind. I work on the
yes.
novel, finish the novel, and then work on short fiction.
Yes, that's right. Yes, I can't. Well, I mean, I think for me, it's a very bad idea to work on more than one new piece of fiction at a time. I mean, I might. It's possible. I might, alongside doing a first draft of something, maybe do some work on a rewrite. But I mean, even that would be something I prefer not to do. I probably can do, because they're two such separate processes, but
Mhm.
never two new pieces of fiction at once. Never for me.
I hunger for the short fiction. I love that style of writing. I like, cutting myself
Mhm.
off and making sure I fit my story in a certain word count. Do
Yes.
you have a preference of length that you like to work with?
Well, no, not. Well, I must admit, these days I do find the novel is a lot of fun, because basically, it can take you by surprise in so many ways, and develop in ways the characters too, in ways you would not have predicted. I mean, basically I like to come up here to my workroom in the morning and surprise myself, do stuff I didn't know I was going to write until I wrote it, and the novel seems to me to be more productive of that sort of a thing. But yes, I still certainly do like to write short stories, and I wouldn't ever stop doing that. I've got too many ideas, and I want to get
Right.
out there while I've got time.
I love that phrase that you just used. Go up to your writing nook and surprise yourself with a new piece of writing.
Mhm.
And I got shivers, because that's exactly what it feels like to write a short piece of fiction, because you don't know what it's going to be until you start writing it. The novel just sits there forever, doesn't it? It languishes. It languishes. It becomes
Um,
like that horrible smell in the refrigerator that you just can't find. It's like, oh my God, is this thing over with yet? I
I
don't
will
know. Do
get.
you find that anxiety that dissipates eventually the more novels that you write, or do you still find, even with the trilogy, the thing that you're writing now that's not going to be released until autumn,
Yep.
that you
Oh,
still have
no,
that
no.
same sense of anxiety?
Oh, there can always be that. I mean, I'm very much an instinctive writer, so I don't plot in advance. I mean, I gather a lot of the material, and I have certainly some sense of the general outline, the general sense of events that are going to take place, but they always change in the writing. And
Hmm.
by that method, I always find there will be a point where I find myself somewhere in the course of the novel, out in the middle of nowhere, not knowing how I got there, and having absolutely no idea of how to get anywhere else from it. But
Yeah.
here's the thing that I find always, if you've let it grow in that organic way, that there may be something in what you've already written that is the key to, or actually the seed of, what you need to write next, the place you need to go next, or the next development. And if you trust it, I find it will do it for you. But by gum, it can be a pretty edgy and nervy experience.
Yeah. And sometimes removing a bunch
Yes,
it reveals what the real story is about. I mean,
there can be that. Yes.
yeah, that's just a fascinating experience. Do you feel comfortable with novel writing, or have you always felt comfortable with it as a medium?
Oh, not always. No, I mean, for heaven's sake, I didn't write a novel for 11 years after I wrote my first published short story, and it was only because my agent Kirby Macaulay was gently chivying me that I should write a novel, because basically those would sell. Short stories really were not going to make us a great deal of money. That I eventually came up with an idea that I thought was strong enough to be the core of a novel, and I duly started it off. And even then, it was kind of tricking myself into writing it. I mean, I woke up one morning and thought, hang on, I've got the opening sentence. And I duly wrote that down. and that led to the first paragraph, and off we went from there. But it was a matter of almost of taking myself unawares to persuade myself that I was going to take this leap into the dark.
So you're a pantser, basically. You're writing by the seat of your pants from beginning to end, just like me. I I have no clue whether I even wrote a novel or a short story until like maybe a year or more later on. Do you always end up starting with that first line, knowing this is going to be a novel, or is it something else, a
Oh
flash piece?
yes,
Or
I mean, I would not ordinarily. I've never found that I've written a short story that's turned into a novel. I not really ever found a short story turning into a novella. I generally have a sort of a sense of the form it's going to take. But I mean, it could be a long short story, but it won't get so long that it won't be a short story.
how do you nip yourself in the bud like that?
I think it's the material that does it. I think it's the theme, if you like, that it won't reach beyond that length. And in a sense, I've just got to, let it tell itself, and then discover. I mean, this said, in the rewriting, I'm going to chop away, a lot of excess stuff, so that the final draft is going to end up, I don't know, maybe 20% shorter than what I originally wrote.
But never 20% longer.
No, not yet, not yet. No.
That's my problem. I always make it grow. It hardly ever
Ah,
shrinks. Unless I've
got it.
overreached that word count, I'm like, oh, okay, I need to cut some of this stuff off.
Sure.
What's next for you in terms of writing?
Well, I mean, I still have to finish this final novel of the trilogy, but I am actually kicking around in my head the next novel, because one thing with me, I always like to know what the next novel is going to be about before I finish the one that's in progress. And I do have certainly I seem to have the title "The Wise Friend," which will be the next year's writing of a first draft of a novel. And it's interesting because I mean, what I tend to do when I'm trying to work out a novel at this stage of the process, and it's still very early, I try to go for motivation and figure out why things happen, why the characters do things, but also actually, why the supernatural events are going to happen. What would make there has to be a reason in some way, even if it's mysterious. I need to have some sense of knowing there's something behind that. And for for weeks, I've been wrestling with this and thinking maybe, although I like the ideas I've got, maybe they don't all fit together, and maybe I'm going to have to chuck one out and keep the rest for this book. But actually, I've just this today really worked out what seems to me to be a very logical way of putting them all together, and which opens all sorts of possibilities. So right now, I'm in that. I'm beginning to find my way to the edge of limbo, I think.
That's got to be a good feeling. I know it is. In terms of to finish up all my podcasts, I kind of ask 3 questions of my
Mhm.
guest. And the first
Okay.
question is, obviously you've been writing so long and you've had so much success in that art form. What do you tell people who are struggling to do what you've done, or don't look like it's ever going to happen for them, or blah blah blah? I'm sure they come to you. What's your standard response to how do I achieve some kind of success in this field?
Basically, carry on doing it. Tell the truth, as much of the truth as you possibly can. Don't get discouraged. Basically, stay true to your own voice, your own vision, and in this field, maybe to your own fears as well.
Fears.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, always strive to meet those fears eye to eye, right? I mean, don't back away from them. That's
Sure.
the best way to do things. My second question is, what are you reading? Like, what's on your night table right now? What are you flipping through?
Right.
What's got your
Oh,
attention?
well, we were talking about reading outside the field. Two things. I've gone back to Robert Aikman's autobiography because I've forgotten just how much fun that is. And I'm also reading Anthony Powell's huge 12-volume set of novels that are dance to the music of time, which I think is great stuff. I mean, wonderful, elegant writing, often very funny, but hugely evocative. Frankly, if I'd read that, I probably wouldn't have done my trilogy, because I would have been so daunted by his achievement. I wouldn't have.
Well, you're a Lovecraftian. I mean, you can't get daunted by greatness. You have to, again, meet that
Well, we've got to
eye
strive,
to
got to
eye.
reach for the peak. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
You're right.
Um, Mr. Campbell, Ramsey Campbell, thank you so much for talking with me. I really appreciated this conversation. Where can people find you on the World Wide Web so they can take advantage of your mastery of the English language and storytelling?
Oh gosh, I mean, you can find my website, which is just ramseycampbell.com, or you can find me on Facebook there, because I'm there as Ramsey Campbell, or I'm out there on Twitter as also Ramsey Campbell. So, you know, it's not hard. Just look for my name, and it'll come and haunt you.
Are you anonymous on Reddit, or are you out in the open on Reddit?
I'm out in the open there too.
Are you Ramsey Campbell on Reddit as well?
I am indeed, yeah.
Do you have your own subreddit set up?
No, I don't know.
Oh man, you should do that. I guarantee it'd probably pop and
Right.
give people an opportunity to get to know your work and you. That's just a really fantastic conversation. Thank you so much.
Oh, Brian, great to speak to you, and maybe see you in Providence, huh?
I wish. I cannot make it to too many cons. I have twin 2-year-olds right now, so they kind of lock us down.
I understand. That's very much a reason, but well, enjoy them instead, huh?
Yeah, and you enjoy Sturkerfest Aracon, actually. And thank you again so much. I really appreciate the conversation, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
You too, Brian. Thanks very much. Good to speak to you.